I was just saying, I hope I get this sort of treatment when I come back for giving normal lectures next year. People looking after me, giving me food and drink and stuff. Okay, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit beyond the material that most of you see me talk about. I do talk a lot about monetary policy, but this is actually going to be a lot about my research in monetary policy. And it's called the who and the how, and you'll see why. I will mention or touch on work that's included in 4 papers, some of which are on my website, some of which will be there soon. They're with a number of co-authors, and in particular, all of them are with someone, a good friend of mine, Stephen Hansen, who's at UPF. They are not at all responsible for what I say here today, but they are equally culpable for anything we write together. So if I say something out, blame me. If you read something in the papers, blame all of us. Okay. So I'm going to start the talk, actually, before I get into the real guts of what I want to do, just to give you all the refresher on monetary policy and why it's important and why it's a key thing. So I'm going to start with the inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, which you should hopefully, most of you be totally familiar with. If you went to Warwick and are doing the economics degree, then you've taken my course, and you definitely should be aware of this. If you're not, go back and check, because it could be on the next exam you take. Okay, so here's the sort of fundamental equation of exchange in this theory. The MV, the money, the amount of money in the system times its velocity equals the price times the transactions, which we're going to proxy by output or GDP, real GDP. Okay? And so the question here is about monetary policy and what happens. Therefore, if we, let's think V is approximately stable. What if we put more money into the system? What's going to happen? Well, we can sort of look through this. We can see that this relationship says that, make sure I do this right. If we put M up, if we increase the amount of money, then, and this isn't changing, then either P or Y is going to have to change. Okay, this is a fundamental equation. It's not a theorem. It's an equation which by definition must hold. One of this P or Y must go up, but which is it? Well, in the short run, in the long run, we know we have big debates in macro about how long is the short run, when does it kick in? But what we mostly agree on is that in the long run, the real GDP stuff is determined by factors like population growth, capital accumulation, technological progress. So in the long run, an increase in M is just going to increase prices. Okay, so that's the sort of key insight from this stuff. And we have lots of evidence on this. If we take averages, over 20-year averages, across many countries and plot them, here you can see this is the growth in money supply, and this is the inflation rate. So as you put more and more money into the system, prices go up by more and more because inflation is just a change in prices. You can take a particular country at a point in time, so long as it's a country that has a lot of variation in this money supply. So here's an example of Argentina, where at times money growth was up at 300 or 400%, and inflation was equally up at around 300 or 400%. So we have lots of evidence that this seems to hold pretty well. And you may think, well, how does it all go that wrong? How do we get into this situation? Well, some of you will have seen me show you these before, but I think the best example of how it can all go wrong is Zimbabwe. Okay? So I don't want to mess with the technology, but hopefully you can see this. This is a 2007 Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe $1 bill. Zimbabwe used the Zimbabwe dollar. So this is the $1 bill, which was currency circulating in 2007. As things started the government started to require more money, they started printing more and more money, and including by 2008, we had the $500,000 bill. $100 million bill. Sorry, $1 million bill. $200 million bill. $500 million bill. The $1 billion bill. $5 billion bill? $10 billion bill, anyone? Screw it. $10 trillion bill. $20 trillion bill. $50 trillion bill. And the piece de resistance, the $100 trillion bill. What would that have purchased you? Well, not very much, because here's how life became. This is paying for dinner in Zimbabwe. And here's a kid with his pocket money. Okay? So what is this telling you? This hyperinflation that occurred from this excessive printing of money got to a position where inflation was running at 98% per day. Okay, so you're all very good at maths, so you can think in your heads, what would that be per year? Storing in the back of your head that in the UK we have an inflation target of 2% per year. This is running at 98% per day. So if I want to construct a yearly rate from that, I have to do 1 plus 98 divided by 100, which is 1.98, raised to the power of 365 equals really big number with like hundreds of zeros, okay? So what do I take from this? I take from this the fact that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and we should be very careful about what we do with monetary policy. So solution is monetary policy. It's called monetary policy because it was meant to be about the control of the amount of money in the system. Of course, actually what tends to happen is we tend to talk in terms of interest rates in the real world, but that's a distinction that I'm not going to be concerned about today. What I am going to be concerned about is what was discovered, or what was really emphasized in the 90s, was giving monetary policy to independent central banks. And by independent, we mean independent from interference by interested parties, by the government in particular. What we found was that the more independent the central bank, the lower they were able to keep inflation under control. So this sort of push towards independence was important, but pushing towards independence brought with it a really big challenge, because you're giving a very important policy tool to somebody who is probably not elected. Okay, so the central bank governor is typically a technocrat, somebody who's very good at economics, but maybe hasn't been chosen by the people. Now, one solution would be we could implement a sort of X factor for central bankers, and the people could vote on who the next governor could be. I'm not sure that's ideal. So what instead has happened is there's been a big move to giving the control to committees. So you get a bunch of experts together, and you allow them to jointly discuss and make the decisions. And I don't really want to associate myself with the NRA necessarily, but to paraphrase one of their often quoted lines, central banks don't set interest rates. People and policymakers set interest rates. Well, policymakers set them, and as far as I'm aware, policymakers are people. And so when we talk, and when I talk to you in Money and Banking or EC 108, and I say, oh, the central bank does this, it's actually not the central bank. There are people in the central bank doing things. And so given that we have this greater use of committees, and committees are groups of people making decisions together, what my research is doing, and what I'm talking about for the rest of today, is the fact that we have to understand the people who are doing it and how the people are behaving and what their incentives to behave are like. So it's really putting, as I said, the who and the how into the analysis of central banking. And the three main questions I sort of have to think about is, the first one, the who, is does the appointment of different types of people, and I'm going to focus on one particular distinction, and that's the distinction between outside experts and internal central bankers on the Monetary Policy Committee in the UK. Does that matter? How should we think about it? Do policymakers behave as theory predicts? How do they behave? And in particular, how do they behave over time, dynamically? Do they behave in a sort of way that we think is understandable? And finally, the more work in progress aspect, what happens behind closed doors? So these people sit and they meet and they get lots of discussion. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I have been privy to be an employee of a number of different central banks, and I've got to watch some of this from the inside. But a lot of it, we still need to think a lot more about exactly what's happening, how the discussion takes place, and I'll come on to that. But in order to get there, I'm going to introduce a very simple model of decision-making, and then we're going to look at this model in two particular ways. So think of C as our central banker. We're just thinking, forget about the committee for a minute, just think about one person making a decision. There's inflation, which depends on the interest rate. If they choose a higher interest rate, so I'm just going to assume they're choosing between a low rate 0 and a high rate 1. Actually not such a big simplification. Almost every monetary policy committee meeting in the United Kingdom has been choosing between two rates. There's been two options on the table. They sort of know which are the two choices to make. Okay? So it's going to depend on interest rates, inflation, and it's also going to depend on the state of the world. We can think about that like the economy, how inflationary the economy is. But the thing is, we don't know with any full certainty what the state of the world is. And Sir David Henry has just told us that the Bank of England can't predict perfectly what the world is like. This is capturing that sort of assumption. But we're going to have some idea, some sort of probability. We're going to know this what we call this prior belief Q, we're going to say is the percentage chance we attribute to being the high inflationary state of the world. Okay? But uncertainty is obviously key here. And the people making the decision are going to differ in two dimensions. One dimension is what I'm going to call preferences, but you can call it their bias, you can call it their leaning, their inclination, whatever you like. What this is that there's this UK journalism and now more widely held distinction using Avarian labels, so hawks and doves. So this theta is going to capture hawkishness. I think hawkishness is a word that was made up, but anyway. Hawkishness being your inclination towards having higher interest rates. Okay? So there's lots of ways you can justify this, and I'll show you some more a little bit later, but for now, just think it's capturing some kind of burden of proof. Okay? So this is like the payoffs to the decision maker. If we're in a low inflationary world and they choose the low interest rate, they're happy. They get a 0. If they're in the high inflationary world and they choose the high interest rate, they're happy. They get 0. Everybody, hawks and doves, wants to get the right decision. Okay? How do they differ? Well, they differ because if you're hawkish, let's say your theta is greater than 0.5, then if you choose the high interest rate and the actual state of the world was the low inflation one, your loss is smaller. So hawks would rather choose high when it should have been low than low when it should have been high, and it's the reverse for doves. So everybody wants to get it right. It's just hawks. If we're going to make a mistake, a hawk says, I'm going to have too high interest rates, so I'll be too tough on inflation. Okay. It could be that people actually have different inflation targets. I don't like that because one of my applications is to the Bank of England and the UK government tells them what their objective should be. So then we'd be assuming that people ignore what they're told to do, and I don't like that assumption. The other is we could think about their trading off output losses and inflation losses, and they put different weights on it. So we can come back to that. It's all going to come down to the same sort of thing. Okay, so how does this person make the decision? The decision is made. They have some information that comes from this common data, the GDP numbers, the forecasts, all of this stuff. They also get some private signal. This private signal we can think of as what the model in their head says. They sit there, they look at everything, and they go, no, I think it's low state, high state. We're going to assume everybody gets pretty good signals. They're on average correct, but that people can differ in how precise their signals are. So this sigma thing is going to measure how expert a member is. So now members are going to differ along the two dimensions. They're going to differ in how expert they are and in their bias, their leanings, their preference. Okay, so I don't want to go into the full details of the model. The basic model in this world is really, really simple. Come up with an assessment, a belief about the state of the world, and in particular, decide how likely you think it is that the state of the world is inflationary. And if that's above a certain cutoff, where the cutoff is given by your preferences, so a hawk who's very nervous about having low interest rates when it should be high, they're going to have a lower cutoff. So this burden of proof idea. If your best guess of the state of the world is above your burden of proof, you choose the high interest rate and low otherwise. So it's actually quite simple. And what is your best guess of the world? Well, it's some combination of the information you get from the common data and you update it using your signal, your private signal. And of course, the expertise enters here. If you are the ultimate expert, you get the perfect signal, then you put no weight on the common prior information. You can ignore GDP. You just wait to see what your brain says, because it knows everything. If you're the opposite, imagine your sigma was actually infinity. You get absolutely useless signals. They hold no information whatsoever. You would put zero weight on what signal you get, and you would base your decision entirely on the common data. So if the common data says it looks like we're in the low inflationary world, you would vote for the low interest rate. Okay, and you get this cutoff rule, which I don't want to go into, but basically there's some threshold. If your signal is above a certain amount, if this message in your head is above a certain level, you're going to vote for the high interest rate, and otherwise you'll vote low. Okay, everyone okay so far? I haven't bamboozled you with equations so far. Now I'm going to show you pictures, because they're more fun. Okay, so I don't want to go into the full way in which we can test this model, but I want to give you some sense of what econometricians call identification. That is, how can we use things like the voting data? So if I watch how Patrick has voted over all these periods, how could I use that to try and extrapolate something about whether he's got preferences for a particular type of rate or whether he's an expert or not an expert? Okay? And the answer comes from this figure here. This is, imagine each of these lines represents a different type of person, and each line, they differ only in their preferences. Okay? What you see is that depending on the state of the world, the probability they vote high, this is the common prior, and assuming different states, but let's just focus on this state equals 0 world. As the data points to the state of the world being inflationary, the probability you vote for the high goes up. Okay, so if the data looks like it's 90% certain it's a high interest rate world, most people are going to vote for high interest rates. Where the differences come is somebody who's more hawkish is more likely to vote for high interest rates for any given prior. So you take someone who's a hawk and someone who's a dove. The hawk is blue, the dove is red. Whatever the data is telling us, the hawk is more likely to vote for high interest rates. So the probability the hawk votes for high interest rate shifts as they become more hawkish for any given common prior. This is what happens if we take two people who have the same preferences, but we make one more expert than the other. The person who's more expert, in this case, is going to be the blue, the lower sigma. They are sometimes going to be more likely to vote for the high interest rate and sometimes less likely. So the probability that they vote for the high interest rate doesn't shift in one way or the other, but it actually rotates in this funny way. So sometimes it's higher and sometimes it's lower. Why is that? Because of this logic. The person who is an expert puts less weight on the commonly held view. They have more unique sort of view. Okay, that's just the background. Here's the actual, if you add a committee, you get extra correlation, you get this sort of very complicated likelihood function. Let's ignore it. You can look at the paper for all the beautiful details. Let's now apply it to the Bank of England to think about the internal and external members. So here's the one-page cheat sheet on the Bank of England, MPC. They started in June 97. They met every month since then, and I'm going to stop because it's a big structural break. It's a big shift in the distribution in March 2009, which is when they started making decisions about quantitative easing. Clear objective function, as I said. Everybody gets a vote, so it's very independent within the committee. And there are 5 members who are internal: the governor, 2 deputy governors, chief economist, and head of financial markets area. And then there are 4 people who are appointed from from outside the Bank of England. They're appointed by the Treasury, and they get to sit in on the meetings and put their vote forward about what they think is right. In our sample, we have 13 internal members and 14 external members. Of course, there's lots of discussion, and they get briefings and all this sort of stuff. And voting is a bit random. There's some structure to it, but in general, the governor just chooses people in the order that he wants in some random way. We take this very complicated likelihood function, and we can estimate it, and the details, as I said, are there. And here's what we find when we look at the difference between the average internal member and the average external member. There is, of course, heterogeneity within that, but we're going to focus on the average. What do we find? In terms of theta, remember that's their preferences. The average internal is more hawkish than the externals. You may say, we knew that, Michael. Wow, you took a lot of maths to tell us something which the papers have told us many times. That's true, but we did it right. Okay. So we get this result, and it's significantly different. So internals are, on average, more hawkish than externals. This is a well-known result people talk about. But we show that it still holds when you allow them to also differ in terms of expertise. And what is the difference in expertise? Well, actually, we find that internals are estimated to be significantly, in a statistical and, it turns out, an economic sense, more expert than the external members. Okay? Let's just pause that result for a minute, because I am going to come back to it. But what we can do now is we can ask some interesting questions. How big should a committee be? Should it have internals and externals? Well, what this shows is now, for different values of this common prior, what the gain from going from one average internal member to 5 internal members. So we've gone from a committee of 1, which is not a very interesting committee, it's just a person, to a committee of 5. But they're all internals. What you get is gains of about 10 percentage points in the probability that the committee makes the right decision. Why? Because the world is uncertain. If you take one expert, they're basing it on their random draw. If you take 5 experts, they're now going to average their random draws, and we're more likely to get the right answer. Of course, the committee adds very little when the world is certainly in the low state or certainly in the high state. It's only in the middle, where the common prior is a bit uncertain, that we get these big gains, as we would expect. So we see pretty substantial gains from going from 1 to 5. Committees seem like a good thing. What if we now extend it from 5 to 9, but sticking with all internals? Very marginal gains, of the order 1% gains, in the percentage point gains in the probability they get it right. And this is, of course, not at all taking account of the fact that there are likely costs to having a bigger committee. I don't know how many of you have sat on committees. A committee of 3 people is easier to get discussion done than a committee of 43 people, because there's too many people talking, hard to control. Okay, so if there are costs to adding members, we show that the benefits are at least falling away pretty quickly. What if we add the external members instead of internal members? How does that change things? Well, if we add them, what you see is a much funnier picture. What do we get? We actually get losses over certain areas and gains over certain areas, but on average, very little extra gain. Why? Well, we're adding members who are less expert. So you always want to add more expert people to expert committees. But what we are getting here is some effect of having different preferences. So they're shifting the likelihood we end up in different places because they have different preferences. Okay. So what does that tell us? Well, the first result that I want you to take away from this is people do matter, the type of experts we appoint do matter, and that we can do a bit more to think about how we set up these committees, how we design them in order to try and get the optimal sort of design. And our takeaway would be a committee of about 5 would be right. A committee like the European Central Bank or even the FOMC that has 15, 20, 25 members certainly seems to be getting a bit large. Let me do one other, the other thing, the dynamic thing. Here's a quote from the BBC website, which I think captures exactly what is sort of in my head when I think the story. This is when Mario Draghi, an Italian, was appointed to become head of the European Central Bank. Historically, Italians do not have a good record with monetary policy. Historically, Germans do. Okay? Hence, the Bundesbank was the model for the ECB, not the Bank of Italia. Okay? But they appointed an Italian. This really freaked out some Germans. And in his first press conferences, he was very, very hawkish. He was very anti-inflationary. And this quote, I think, captures it. If you're sitting in Spain or Portugal, countries suffering, you might well wonder whether you would have been better off with a German in charge trying to show off his inner Italian than an Italian desperate to prove he's German underneath. Okay? So what's this about? This is about a very classical story in economics called signaling. Okay? In a world, and I'll skip the model for now, but this is the slightly more formal model, but where we now add this expectations augmented Phillips curve. Not the new Keynesian Phillips curve, that's different, but what Sir David was talking about, where inflation depends on expectations. We now build that in. Now you get a new thing. Now we're going to have the guy repeat the game, so he's going to play it more than once. What's going to happen now is the policymaker has an incentive in the early periods to behave like a hawk. Why? Because when they behave like a hawk, the public learns about their type, thinks they're hawkish, therefore expects lower inflation, and therefore they can sort of gain in later periods from having convinced the world that they're a hawk. They anchor inflation expectations at a good place. So we can do the same thing. I'll skip that. Everyone has an incentive to build a hawkish reputation. And then what we can do is we can again look at the data of the Bank of England and see whether they behave in that way. So we just create a simple dummy variable, which is 1 if they have 18 months of experience and 0 in their first 18 months. So what happens to the probability? This is a linear probability model, including person fixed effects, time fixed effects. We're sort of sweeping up a lot of this stuff. On average, MPC members vote for lower rates as they spend more time on the committee, at least in the sample that we have. Exactly as it would predict, members on average, there are lots of things that could affect their dynamic behavior, but members, on average, become more dovish. So when we first found this fact, myself and Stephen, we called it delayed dovishness. Or in other words, these guys were trying to pretend to be Germans when they first go on, and then it goes away over time. Now, you may worry, and this is just, you can look at the different people. Almost everybody is above the 45-degree line and shifts, so therefore they're shifting down over time. This is their fixed effect, their average voting behavior when they're experienced versus when they're new. Okay, but you may sort of immediately worry that, Michael, you've just shown us what we think of as a reduced form regression. We don't know if it is their preferences that are changing over time. What if their expertise is changing? Well, we can do what we did before, estimate the same model, and we can get these theta and sigma differences. And what we see is that it's all driven by their preferences. In fact, if anything, people become a little less expert as they spend time on the Monetary Policy Committee. It's not significantly different from 0, but the direction is that the average member puts more and more weight on the common information and less on on everything else. Okay, how long do I have? 2 minutes? 10? Oh, I raced through that. We're going to have the world's longest Q&A. So start thinking of Qs, and I'll start making up As. Okay, now I'm going to talk for loads. I thought I was going to have no time at all to talk about this. See, I think the elapsed time on this is putting me off. Okay. Well, if I jump back to the start. Now here. When I showed you this, I parked the idea of expertise. And I said, it looks like external members are less expert. And therefore, when we do our our counterfactual experiment, it looks like external members don't add very much. This is my result, my paper. I don't believe it. Okay? I do believe it. I believe the estimates, and I believe what we're doing, and we've done it all right. We can't capture something. Okay? All this work we're doing with the Bank of England is based entirely on their voting records and lots of common information that we use to guess the state of the world. Why don't I believe it? Because externals may add a lot that we can't measure. Okay? So what we're not capturing is what happened in the room when we had the mixed committee versus all internals. Okay? So it could be that when they go into the room to make the decision, the externals bring new ideas, bring new stuff, new thought, and even if those new ideas are wrong, which I'm not saying they are, but even if they were wrong, there is at least psychological evidence, and this was pointed out to Stephen and I by Tim Harford, who wrote up some of our results in his FT column. There are psychological experiments to show that actually having one person dissent or give contrarian views encourages everybody to speak more freely their mind. So there are these experiments where they draw lines on a board where one line is clearly longer than the other, and they line 10 people up, and everyone's sort of standing around. The first person has to pick the line they think is longest. Let's say line A is longer. They walk up, and the person A goes, B. And then the second person says B, and the third says B. Now, actually, the first 9 people are all part of the experiment. They're told to just pick the shorter line. And the person who's 10th sort of goes up, and they're visibly sweating and nervous and all. And they're like, their eyes tell them that A is clearly longer. But everybody seems to say B is longer. So through tears and pain, they choose B, which is clearly wrong. Okay? And then what they do is they repeat this, but anywhere in the 1 to 9, they put one person who says A, and then almost everybody then just goes with what their eyes are telling them. So if there's a whole weight of opinion that's all in agreement, it might force people to stifle their own views. So we want to know that. We want to see how discussion actually takes place, what happens behind closed doors. Okay? Ooh. And we're dead. Well, let me tell you what we're doing anyway, and then they'll put it up. Because on my screen, it can... No, it's dead. Okay. No, we're back. We're back alive. Okay. So what we're doing is, we can't do any of this for the Bank of England. The Bank of England releases minutes, but they're unattributed. So we don't know who said what. We don't know what order. We get a sort of bunch of intelligent, very senior staff from the Bank of England sit in the meeting, take notes. Then after the meeting, they come up with what is a nice, well-scripted discussion of what took place. And then they burn all the actual notes of how people said it, all the mistakes they made, all the silly things that were said, and they get rid of all that. Luckily, the US Federal Reserve does not. They recorded all their meetings because they had to make the minutes, but they forgot to destroy the tapes. And then someone discovered they forgot to destroy the tapes, and now they have to release the tapes with a 5-year lag. So we know not just what was said, but we know who said it, at what time, and all this stuff. So what we've done is we're now taking this, we've got it all digitized, and we're analyzing it using the tools of computational linguistics. Whenever I try and explain this to people, I just say, think Google. Okay? Think about the way Google has now become... Well, you guys are probably still too young to remember. When I first started using search engines, you had to use Boolean searches. So you had to type the word you wanted, and then a big capital and then another word you wanted, and it would search. But if your one word was misspelt, it would get it wrong. Or if you put, inflation, but the word was inflationary, it wouldn't pick it up. There's all sorts of problems. Now, you type in 3 words into Google, and it just gets it right. Sometimes it tells you that you're wrong. Michael, I think you meant... Oh, yeah. Yes, I did. Thank you very much. So think about those tools of language and language modeling, and we're applying them to this discussion to try and figure. And one thing that we're really interested in is to understand, as Sir David was actually referring to, we didn't coordinate at all, but he set me up very nicely, is this idea which in economics we call rational inattention. So there is stuff that's out there that's blindingly obvious, but we miss it. And sometimes people talk about it, but we still miss it. So we're looking at how topics, for example, in the US situation, in the run-up to 2007, 2008, people were still talking about housing markets. The Fed staff were briefing on housing markets, but why was the discussion not about housing markets? Who talked about it? Why were they ignored? These are the type of things we're now trying to look at, how to best introduce ideas, how to best get discussion. So we don't have that work done, so it's all work in progress. I'm very excited by it as work. But the one thing I thought I would show you, because I love this chart. I don't think we're the first people to ever show this chart, but well, I think this particular version of the chart, yes, but we've got this measure where from the tapes you can work out when there was jovial laughter in the room. So it records when people laughed, not just one person giggling on their own like a psychopath, but the room. So that moment there would have been classified as square brackets laughter, square brackets. Okay, so we know this from the transcript. We can work out an index of it. That's the red line, and I've plotted on top of it the U.S. housing market, measured by the Case-Shiller index. From 95, quite flat, quite flat, quite flat, house prices start going up, giddiness builds in the room. And I showed this to a co-author of mine who's not involved in this project the other day, and he said, wow, whatever happened in that meeting was the peak of the housing market. Now, actually, I'm really disappointed because I haven't been able to add it in time for this, but if you watch my website, I will eventually update it. The 2007 transcripts have just been released, so we have to digitize them fully and get them in, but then we'll be able to see whether it ceased being a fun place to hang out. But anyway, so that's it. Let me conclude with my who. It's really the who, how, and how, but I couldn't tell you the answer to the last how. The first is the who and how many. Is the issue of we need to think carefully about people on monetary policy committees, because committees are people and they're making important decisions, and different combinations can add different amounts of value. We need to think carefully there. How do they behave over time? Well, amazingly, very much in line with what our theory predicts. And finally, the big open question is how does the discussion take place? And then maybe we can see then that these external members, or in the case of the Federal Reserve System, the bank presidents from the regional feds, maybe they can add more value through introducing topics which then cause everyone to talk about them. Or maybe we'll find that when someone introduces a topic, they're just ignored completely. All to be done still. But I will stop there and let you Q&A me.
Okay, we have time for a question or two. So are there any questions? Right, straight up, stand there.
Working?
I think it's working.
Is it working? Yeah. Thank you very much for your talk. My question is on the people who are actually on these committees. Do you think we'll see in a generation or so, do you think we'll see a shift in the types of people on these committees where we'll have people with their academic background in this time, not in the stagflationary 70s, which a lot of the people who are on these committees have now? Do you think we'll see a shift in sort of monetary policies geared more towards stopping unemployment, such as what the Fed did now just before 2013?
So I agree with the first part of the statement and not the second, so let me be clear. I think we will see differences, and I think there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that people's both actual upbringing but also their professional upbringing in the world in which they mature as, say, an economist or a banker or whatever. I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that this affects how they think about the world. So they do these analyses where they just ask people how much they dislike inflation. And it turns out all of us, or almost all of us in this room, probably don't think inflation is that big a deal, because most of us have lived through periods of relatively low and stable. And like I say, people are getting a bit worried about 3.5% inflation in the UK. I mean, the target is 2, being at 3.5. Is that the end of the world? We're not Zimbabwe. We're a long way off Zimbabwe. But people who've lived through hyperinflations, they think inflation is incredibly costly. So we certainly see that first part where we'll see people do. Where I think the biggest difference will be is I think going forward, we're going to see a much bigger emphasis from macroeconomists and monetary economists on issues of financial systems and banking systems. So I think a lot more. In fact, I'm delighted. So the money and banking course which I teach here, I actually designed the course in 2007, just before Northern Rock. And one of the big sections I always put in, it was always something I thought was important, were balance sheets. I think understanding balance sheets is a really important thing when thinking about the banking sector. Now, I was orders of magnitude off in terms of how important they would turn out to be. But I think going forward, I think you'll have members of monetary policy committees who'll be very aware that there's also a financial policy committee and that there's interactions between the two. And I think there's a big open question still about when designing a committee, say, for monetary policy, how many members should also be on, say, a financial policy committee? Should they be separate? Should they be all the same? There's a lot of analysis that still needs to be done on that, but I think that's the direction we'll go in.
Okay, I've been told we have to move on, I'm afraid, so I'm really sorry about that. I know there's loads of questions, but can we thank Michael again for his talk?